The studio lights dimmed at Paisley Park on June 15, 1987, when Whitney Houston walked into Prince's domain. But what happened next would shatter the ego of music's greatest multi-instrumentalist and prove that sometimes one voice is worth an entire symphony. If you love stories about musical legends and unexpected moments of humility, make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below about your favorite Whitney Houston moment. It was the summer when Whitney Houston's second album had just gone diamond, when I Want to Dance with Somebody was dominating every radio station in America, when the 23-year-old vocalist from Newark was being called the greatest voice of her generation. She had conquered pop radio, R&B charts, and even crossed into adult contemporary, something almost unheard of for a young black woman in 1987. Her face was on every magazine cover, her voice the soundtrack of summer. But in Minneapolis, inside the purple fortress of Paisley Park Studios, one man wasn't impressed. Prince Rogers Nelson had built an empire on one undeniable fact: he didn't need anyone. While other artists relied on session musicians, backup singers, and massive production teams, Prince played every instrument on his albums, all 27 of them: drums, bass, guitar, keyboards, horns. He was a one-man orchestra, and he made sure everyone knew it. His self-sufficiency wasn't just a skill, it was his identity. Growing up in Minneapolis, Prince had learned early that relying on others meant disappointment. Band members would quit, collaborators would take credit, the music industry would try to control you. So Prince had made himself untouchable. If he could do everything himself, nobody could ever let him down. Nobody could ever claim they made him who he was. By 1987, this philosophy had created both a genius and an island. Prince's albums were masterpieces of one-man production, but his relationships with other musicians were notoriously difficult. He had a reputation for dismissing other artists' talents, for believing that true artistry meant complete independence. Singers are performers, Prince had told Rolling Stone magazine just weeks earlier, but musicians are creators. Anyone can stand in front of a microphone. It takes genius to create the entire soundscape. Whitney's team had arranged a meeting at Paisley Park to discuss a potential collaboration. Her manager thought it would be good for her image to work with someone from the Minneapolis sound. But when Whitney arrived that Monday afternoon, wearing a simple white t-shirt and jeans, her hair pulled back, no makeup, she had no idea she was walking into an ambush. Prince was in Studio A, surrounded by instruments, a drum kit to his left, 3 keyboards in front of him, guitars hanging on the walls like artwork. He was wearing his signature purple outfit, sitting at a grand piano, his fingers dancing across the keys with effortless precision. "Whitney Houston," Prince said without looking up, his voice soft but carrying an unmistakable edge. "The voice. That's what they call you, right?" "That's what some people say," Whitney replied, her tone friendly but cautious. Something in the room felt off. Prince finally looked at her, his eyes intense behind his perfectly styled hair. "I've been listening to your album. Very pretty. Narada Michael Walden did excellent production work. Great musicians on those tracks." "Thank you," Whitney said, sensing the but coming. "But I have a question." Prince stood up, walking to the wall of guitars. "Without that production, without that band, without all those studio musicians, what are you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Whitney's manager started to interject, but Whitney held up her hand. "What am I?" she repeated. "Just a voice," Prince said, selecting a guitar from the wall. "Don't get me wrong, it's a beautiful voice, but it's just one instrument." "Me?" He gestured around the studio. "I am the entire composition. I can create a symphony by myself. Can you create anything without a backing track?" What happened next, nobody in that studio would ever forget. Whitney walked to the center of the room. No microphone, no music stands, nothing. She asked the sound engineer to turn off every piece of equipment. Complete silence. "What song do you want?" Whitney asked Prince directly. Prince smirked, still holding his guitar. "Surprise me." Whitney closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and then something extraordinary happened. She began clapping her hands, not randomly, but creating a rhythm, a beat that instantly sounded like a snare drum and hi-hat combined. The precision was remarkable. Each clap had different tones depending on how her palms met, creating layers of percussion that shouldn't have been possible from just two hands. Then she started singing How Will I Know, but not the version anyone had heard before. She sang the first verse a cappella, her voice carrying the melody while her hand claps provided percussion. Her voice had this incredible warmth, this natural richness that filled the studio even without amplification. No microphone was capturing this. It was pure acoustic power, the same power that had once filled New Hope Baptist Church in Newark when she was just a teenage girl singing for Sunday service. But when she reached the pre-chorus, she did something that made every person in that studio freeze. She started layering her own voice, creating harmonies in real time, singing the lead melody while simultaneously humming the bass line, then adding a soprano harmony on top. It wasn't studio trickery or overdubbing. It was happening live, right there, her vocal cords shifting between registers so quickly that it created the illusion of multiple singers. The technique came from years of gospel training. Her mother, Sissy, had taught her that in Black church tradition, when you didn't have a choir, one voice had to become many. You had to hear the entire arrangement in your head and bring it to life through your instrument, your voice. It was as if her vocal cords had become a one-woman choir. Prince's smirk began to fade. He lowered his guitar slowly, his fingers loosening their grip on the neck. Whitney moved into the chorus, and now she was using her voice like instruments. Sharp, rhythmic hit sounds became drum hits, percussive pops created by her breath and throat that mimicked the snap of a snare. Smooth, sustained notes became string sections, her voice gliding through the melody like a violin section. Percussive breath techniques created the sound of shakers and tambourines. She was building an entire instrumental track using only her voice and body. The studio engineer, Susan Rogers, instinctively reached for the mixing board, then stopped herself. There was nothing to mix. This was all happening acoustically, right there in the room. But the most stunning moment came during the bridge. Whitney split her voice into 4 distinct harmonies: soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, cycling through them so quickly and seamlessly that it sounded like 4 different people singing at once. It was vocal architecture, a cathedral of sound built from a single voice. Prince's engineer, Susan Rogers, would later recall, "I had never seen Prince look like that. His jaw literally dropped. He set down his guitar like it was suddenly too heavy to hold." Whitney wasn't showing off. She wasn't trying to prove superiority. She was simply demonstrating that her instrument, her voice, was as versatile, as powerful, and as complete as any collection of guitars, drums, and keyboards could ever be. When she finished, the studio was silent for what felt like an eternity. Whitney's hands stopped clapping. Her voice faded into the air. And in that silence, something profound had shifted. Prince walked slowly toward Whitney, his expression completely transformed. The cockiness was gone. The competitive edge had vanished. What remained was pure, genuine awe. This was a man who had spent his entire life proving he didn't need anyone. And in 3 minutes, a young woman from Newark had shown him that completeness could exist in forms he'd never imagined. "How did you—" he started, then stopped. His voice was different now, smaller, almost vulnerable. "Where did you learn to do that?" Whitney smiled, the tension finally breaking. Her breathing was still slightly elevated from the performance. "My mother, Sissy Houston, is a gospel singer. In church, when you don't have a band, when you don't have instruments, you learn to become the instrument. Your voice has to be the choir, the organ, the drums, everything. That's how I grew up. That's where this comes from." "I've been playing instruments since I was 7, Prince said quietly, still processing what he'd just witnessed. "I thought that made me complete. I thought being able to play everything meant I was self-sufficient, that I didn't need anyone." He paused. "But you just showed me that a voice can be all the instruments. You are a complete orchestra by yourself." It was perhaps the most humble statement Prince had ever made publicly. The meeting that was supposed to be about collaboration turned into something else entirely, a masterclass in mutual respect. For the next 3 hours, Prince asked Whitney questions about vocal technique, breathing, harmony construction, the gospel tradition she came from. The man who never admitted he had anything to learn was learning. He wanted to understand how she created those bass tones, how she switched registers so seamlessly, how she maintained rhythm while singing melody. Whitney, in turn, asked him about his compositional process, about how he heard entire arrangements in his head before playing them. They discovered they weren't so different. Both heard complete musical pictures in their minds. Prince expressed it through multiple instruments. Whitney expressed it through one. "Play me something," Whitney said at one point. Prince picked up his guitar and played a complex jazz fusion piece, his fingers moving impossibly fast across the fretboard, demonstrating his legendary skill. When he finished, Whitney said, "That's beautiful, but can I ask you something?" "Anything. Why do you feel like you have to play every instrument? What are you trying to prove?" The question hit Prince harder than any criticism ever had. He was quiet for a long moment. "I guess, I always felt like if I needed someone else, if I had to rely on another musician, it meant I wasn't enough." Whitney nodded. "I understand that. But you know what I learned from gospel? The most beautiful music happens when voices come together, when instruments unite, when we realize that needing each other isn't weakness, it's strength." That conversation changed Prince. A year later, in a 1988 radio interview, he said something that shocked the music industry. "I used to think I was the music. Then I met Whitney Houston. Her voice is an instrument. Strings, horns, percussion, everything. I was humbled. She showed me that collaboration isn't about losing yourself. It's about finding something bigger." In 1990, Prince and Whitney finally did collaborate, working together on a track that was never released but became legendary among those who heard it. Engineers who were present said Prince mostly just listened, letting Whitney's voice guide the composition instead of controlling every element himself. "He was different after that day," Susan Rogers recalled years later. "He still played all his own instruments on most projects, but he started seeking out other musicians more, valuing their contributions instead of seeing them as threats to his genius." Whitney, for her part, rarely talked about the encounter publicly, but those close to her said it gave her a new confidence. She had walked into the domain of music's most intimidating perfectionists and proved that her gift was just as complete, just as powerful, just as self-sufficient as his. The story became legend in Minneapolis music circles. The day Whitney Houston taught Prince humility with nothing but her voice. When Prince died in 2016, Whitney had already been gone for 4 years, but their brief intersection remained one of the most talked about moments in Paisley Park history. A studio where egos typically ruled, where musical genius was measured in how many instruments you could master, had witnessed something more profound, the moment when one voice proved it could contain an entire orchestra. Prince's final lesson wasn't about playing more instruments or creating more complex arrangements. It was about recognizing greatness in forms he hadn't imagined, about understanding that a voice trained in the gospel churches of Newark could be just as musically complete as any multi-instrumentalist prodigy from Minneapolis. Two legends, one studio, one unforgettable moment of artistic truth. What do you think about this incredible moment? Have you ever witnessed someone being humbled by pure talent? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories about music's greatest artists.